Shabbat Shalom. My wife Brittany and I are very excited to be here and share this time with you. Eli Saul today becomes bar mitzvah. He is as good a guy as can be. He gives great hugs, wears a great smile. His great-grandmother, Bubby B., at age 97, who's with us today, once said of him, "He looks as if he just swallowed a canary." Eli plays piano and ukulele beautifully. He's very musical, as we know from hearing him chant Torah and Haftarah. And you've just heard that his first name was named for my late father-in-law, Rabbi Ernst Lorge, who had a remarkable rabbinate and who lives on as a family legend among us. Eli is one of 4 great-grandchildren named for him. The others, Emily, Ella, and Eden, are all with us here today to help celebrate. Eli read from the Torah about the sacrifice of these 2 goats to make expiation for the sins of the people. One of them at the altar by the priest, and the other was driven into an inaccessible place in the wilderness. I want to talk about those 2 goats, plus a fictitious 3rd goat, and then a turn of phrase 4th goat as well, as they illustrate the importance of getting rid of our sense of sin, of guilt, and especially dealing with this terrible vice of anger, which I consider the main vice that causes us to sin. We all know about feeling guilty for this or that, and how easily we can be reminded of our guilt. You know the one about the Jewish psychiatrist who said to his patient in his office, "What's that you say? You've been coming to see me for 20 years, and now you tell me that you still feel guilty? You should be ashamed of yourself." My apologies to any psychiatrists among us. The sacrifice of the 2 goats recounted in Leviticus 16, of course, reflects the Yom Kippur ritual in the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The high priest offered the first one at the altar, and the second one, also designated by lot, was escorted out to the nearby wilderness, probably the Judean desert southeast of Jerusalem, near the Dead Sea. The man released the goat into an inaccessible part of the wilderness, and that second goat is the origin of our English word, scapegoat. Originally, escapegoat. He didn't escape. We know that these 2 goats were offered on Yom Kippur, as Eli said, because later in Leviticus 16, verse 19, it actually tells us the calendar date for the sacrifice, the 10th day of the 7th month, which we know as Yom Kippur. Both goats made expiation for the sins of the people. Centuries later, when the early rabbis came on the scene, the real originators of Judaism as we know it, they wrote the first book of Jewish laws and lore called the Mishnah, compiled near the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era. The Mishnah describes that ritual of how the high priest in the temple would read the story aloud from Leviticus 16 about the 2 goats every Yom Kippur. In fact, it is still the Torah reading on Yom Kippur morning in Orthodox and conservative congregations to this very day. The Mishnah, however, adds considerably to the story, including a new fact about the goat escorted into the wilderness, namely, that the man took the goat bearing the people's sins, not only took it into the wilderness, but pushed it over a cliff to its death. Do not think for a moment that the scapegoat escaped. Another rabbinic book, the early time literature, the Tosefta, even says that if the goat didn't die in the fall from the cliff, the man who escorted it would have to go down and kill it to make sure. The Hebrew says, Dicha'o v'lo met mahu sheyered acharav v'yimitenu. The man pushed it off, but if it didn't die, what then? He would descend after it and kill it. Now this new fact from the Mishnah makes us wonder, why did it absolutely have to die after it was driven out into that barren place? The answer cannot be in doubt. On at least one Yom Kippur, or soon thereafter, during those centuries, the goat taken out to the wilderness managed to return to civilization, and maybe even to Jerusalem itself, still bearing the sins of the people. How could they tolerate such a thing? So the Mishnah makes sure the goat died in the wilderness. If so, we can derive from all this that it is indeed difficult to get rid of this sense of guilt. We all know it. We all have felt it. It comes back. We do teshuvah. We do our prayers of repentance. We give to tzedakah. We help. We apologize. We try to make good. The residues seem to cling to us of this guilt. Even vicarious atonement is tricky. William James once said, "The hell to be endured in the supposed hereafter, of which theology tells, is no worse than the hell we make for ourselves in this world by habitually fashioning our characters in the wrong way." So the first two goats tell us how terribly important it is to deal with the sense of guilt and how difficult it is. So much for the first two goats. The third goat I wish to talk about illustrates the main vice that leads to sin and those feelings of guilt. Many other of the proverbial vices lead to sin, such as greed and lust and jealousy. But the main one, at least in my opinion, is anger. The third goat comes from a fictitious short story by the only Nobel Prize laureate who wrote in Hebrew, Shai Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon. He wrote the story Maaseh Ha'ez, the story of the goat. In 1925 he wrote it. I read it in Hebrew for the first time in an ulpan in Jerusalem in 1960. Perhaps you know the story. It concerns a man living somewhere in diaspora who falls sick from some unnamed disease. His doctor puts him on a special diet of goat's milk, so he buys a goat to provide him with the milk. The goat, however, would disappear now and then for a few days, and then return with her udders full of milk that tasted like paradise. Once the man tells his son to follow the goat and see where it goes. The son ties a cord to the goat's tail and holds on to the gourd as the goat leads him through a long cave underground. They finally emerge into a beautiful land. The goat climbs a carob tree, eats some carobs, comes down and drinks from a spring of water, which is why its milk tasted so good. The son asks some passers-by, "Where am I?" And they tell him, "You are in the land of Israel. You are near the city of Tzfat, of Safed in the Galilee." Incidentally, Agnon used an unusual word for rope in the story. He didn't use the word chut or chevel, the usual words. He used the word mishicha, which has an affinity to the word Mashiach, meaning Messiah. So the son has followed, in a way, the Messiah, leading him back to the land of Israel. I have not read that anywhere, but I believed that is why he used the word Mishicha. Now, near Tzfat, the son sees a row of people dressed in white and singing Lecha Dodi Lekrat Kala as they march toward a synagogue. That poem was written in Tzfat back in the 16th century, so the son knows from the song that Shabbat is about to begin. It's now too late for him to go back through the cave and return, so he writes a note and he folds it and puts it somehow behind the goat's ear, so that when the goat returns to his father in diaspora, the father will find the note and will follow the goat back to the land of Israel. So he thinks. So the father gets the goat, but the note is not apparent to him, and he doesn't see it, he doesn't read it. He just knows that the goat has come back without his son. And he's so angry at that point, he takes his anger out on the goat. He calls in a shochet, a butcher, who kills the goat. And then, of course, as you can guess, the note drops. The father picks it up and reads it and sees that he has missed his chance to go to that blessed land described in our Haftarah today. The mountains drip like wine, the hitifu heharim asis, and all the hills wave with grain. V'chol hagvaot titmogagna. He missed his chance. Well, that's what anger can do to a person. It can make sure the person never arrives in that metaphoric land of milk and honey. The story makes several points: how lovely and wonderful and healthful is the land of Israel, how adventurous and brave is the younger generation that actually finds a way to live there, while the older generation, for whatever reason, does not. And often overlooked, another point of the story is how counterproductive is the anger that results in violent deeds and inevitable guilt. I dare say that we can all think of times ourselves when anger got the better of us. The daily newspapers often include stories of how someone vented his anger on another human being. Anger, you know, is only one letter removed from the word danger. We can sympathize with the boy who got into some trouble and then prayed, "Oh God, please take away my temper, and while you are at it, take away my father's temper too." In the other parasha that we read this morning from the Torah, Parashat Kedoshim, there are some wonderful ethical commandments, including one that says, "Hocheach tochiach et amitecha v'lo tisa alav chet." You may rebuke your fellow man or woman, but not to the point where you bring sin upon yourself. That is, you must restrain yourself at a certain point, no matter what the other person has done, because what you're about to do would be absolutely wrong. And that brings me to the fourth and final goat. You know how in English, whenever we feel overlooked or underappreciated, we can say, "What am I, chopped liver?" In Israel, the counterpart of that phrase is, "Ma ani ez?" What am I, a goat? I wondered for years, why of all animals, the goat? I mean, what did the goat ever do to deserve that place as the lowest of the low animals? Ma ani ez? I suspected over the years that it came into modern Hebrew from the Yiddish. I didn't, however, know that for sure until last year. My suspicions were borne out when I read in the book Born to Kvetch, written by Michael Wex, that in Eastern European shtetls, Jews thought that goats were especially dirty animals. Those Yiddish-speaking Jews developed the expression die kulische Zig, the community goat. So they would say such things as, "You walk in here and take stuff without asking, what do I look like? Die kulische Zig, the community goat." And that reminds me, of course, of the comedian David Steinberg, who used to lament, "My father never lived to see his dream come true of an all Yiddish-speaking Canada." I don't speak Yiddish either, I confess it. To say to someone, "What am I, chopped liver?" or "What am I, a goat?" conveys in a certain tension-relieving way, even a humorous way, that the other person has crossed the line and is guilty of being too pushy. It is akin to the game "They Can't Push Me Around" that Dr. Eric Byrne described in his famous book, Games People Play. The goal of that game is vindication. It has the counterpart in Yiddish, "Speien man nit rein in mein Kasche." Do not spit in my kasha. I'm indebted to Cantor Meisner for helping me with that Yiddish saying. So the humor recognizes the problem and disarms the tension. Rabbi Sam Karf, a Reform rabbi of Houston, Texas, tells the true story of when he was visiting in Tzfat, in the Galilee of Israel. The whole group had some free time to go shopping, and he wandered off to see some of the town. He was separated from his group, and he really got lost until he came upon some Hasidic boys and asked them how to get back to such and such a place where the buses were. The boys, however, decided to have a little fun with Rabbi Karf, and so they said to him in Hebrew, "Ata telech ba'kivun hazeh," go in this way. And the other boy said, "Lo, ata telech ba'kivun hahu," no, go in that way. And they had a good chuckle at his expense until he finally said, "Ma ani ez? What am I, a goat?" And then he said to them in the Yiddish, "Nit shein für a Yid mit a yarmulke." That's not seemly, that's not becoming for anyone to say who wears a yarmulke on his head. And when the boys heard that, they straightened up and they said to him, "Bo itanu, anachnu naredechem et haderech, naredecha et haderech." Come with us, we'll show you the way back. And they took him by the hand, they brought him back to the buses. They did the right thing because In a way, he had used both humor and a little advice to shape up, and they did. And that's a gift, to know how to say the right thing at such a time, in a certain carefree, insouciant display of humor, rather than in the anger that can bring on violence. I suppose even then another person can always say, "Are you trying to be funny?" But Jewish people historically have been very good at using humor to diffuse tension. And not only Jews. Plutarch wrote that when Socrates saw he was becoming angry, he would, quote, lower his voice, cause a smile to spread upon his face, and make the expression of his eyes more gentle, preserving himself from fault and defeat by setting up within himself an influence to counteract his anger, unquote. And that's not just a technique of behavior modification. It's a real approach to life. It's a way of acting so that you do not lose your cool. I forgot to say about Eli, he is as cool a young man as you could ever find, especially when he puts both his hands in his pockets. One can make the argument that religion offers consolation for the pain of life, while humor is the method for dealing with pain playfully. If we want to reduce our anxiety and our sense of guilt, then we should, in general, lighten up. In Freudian terms, we should not let our superegos become too harsh and pound down unnecessarily on our egos. Edmund Burke once said, "People that are greatly guilty are never wise." I would add, more acceptance of our shortcomings and more lightheartedness leads to less anger, less sin, and less feeling of guilt. Anger, yes, should be reserved to fight major evils in our world: war, famine, disease, untimely death, racism. Anger should be reserved to confront outrageous injustices and social inequities. But never, ever may we allow anger to get our goat. Amen.